I would first of all encourage the planter to kind of get a loan, or not everybody would just get a loan to be with God. We all discern differently, but I would encourage them to enter into a very intentional time of unpacking, again, what is the motivation behind my wanting to do this? What is my what's my theology? What is my missiology? What is my ecclesiology in terms of my understanding of the church? And really have them reflect on that as much as possible. What is the purpose of the church? Are you more of a person who's motivated by the internal machinations of the church? You're more of a shepherd than you would be, or a pastor than you would be an apostle? Are you more suited to be a keeper of the aquarium rather than be a fisher for people? But the visioning really is finding out what's inside of that other person and helping them to find a way to articulate it. And I don't spend an awful lot of time anymore with carefully written vision statements and all those kinds of things, especially in the early stages of a church plant. That stuff can get in the way early on.
Well, this vision started in '07. I was sent here to restart a failed church plant. And so there was a footprint in the community. The property had already been purchased, but there were no people. And we started with a very small group of folks, about 13 initially, and spent the whole summer really getting together, building community, and preparing for a launch date in September. During that time, you've got to be able to cast a vision. You've got to have vision. Got to know where you're going. If you're going to be a leader, you're pointing in a direction. In order to point in a direction, you really have to take time to discern that. So I'd spent a good 6 months prior to that just praying about what it was God was calling me to do, not just as a church planter, but what was God wanting to do in this community. God planted the church here. The planter doesn't plant the church. The planter just leads what God is unfolding. And so the vision for this church was to create a safe space where everyone, those who are tired, skeptical, unchurched, disconnected, and frustrated, would love to grow together in their understanding of God. So we were just clear on what it was we were trying to do and began to share that with people. And that all really came out of conversations, like I'd said, about getting out, interacting with people in the community, getting to understand what their needs are, know who they were. Our primary focus was to reach unchurched and disconnected people. So 60% of the folks that attend here today are unchurched, 20% are disconnected. They may have been at church when they were younger but had kind of drifted away from the church. And then the last 20% are folks who just feel called to this ministry.
I thought I had this grandiose vision that we would go to Williamson's Chapel and say, all right, we're going to launch this new campus, and if you want to be a part of this, and we'd have a sermon series about it, and we'd be hand in hand, and that's not exactly how it worked. Rod pulled me aside one day and said, here's the deal. I've been praying about this a lot, and he was a very spiritual person. He, every morning, diligent in his prayer time. And he said, I want you to not ask anybody at all to do this with you. And I'm like, oh, sure. I said, then where are they going to come from? I mean, we need a leadership team. Where are they going to come from? And he said, well, I believe God will bring them to you, and you'll lead them. And I said, well, are you going to announce it in worship? Or are you going to? And he said, no. He said, I really believe that God is going to provide, but you want this to be a healthy DNA. And so in order for this to be a healthy DNA, you need to just wait. People will come to you. And so don't ask a soul. And I want you to pretend that you've been appointed in the middle of somewhere with no building, no people, but you've got some money. And we'll just see what happens. So that was the initial vision. I'm like, this is not exactly what I had in mind. And so what ended up happening, the people that I didn't ask, that just came over the next 8 weeks, it was uncanny. And I even get goosebumps thinking about the conversations and where and when they would happen, because the people that needed to be a part of that launch team, that vision team, they came one by one. I just have this thought, and it won't get out of my mind, and tell me a little bit about this West Campus. And so one by one, people volunteered to serve on this team.
It's interesting because there's a vision that I believe God planted within me several years ago, and then there's the vision of the leadership here. And the amazing thing was just how closely those two visions aligned. So when they presented initially their idea here, the leadership, about what they were looking at doing and some of their initial thoughts, that was one of the things that really stood out to me. Was this is what I've really understood as a great vision initially for today, for the local church today, and it was really what I was trying to implement in where I was serving at the time. But it was going to be a much more complicated and slower process there to implement it, whereas here they wanted to just go ahead and do it all with the full backing of the current leadership and clergy and everybody. So the vision within me was established several years ago just through reading scripture and looking at just this huge disconnect between the story of God's people as we read in scripture and the local church today. And so I really wanted to change that. I really wanted to try to close that gap as a leader in the local church today. And the vision here was just simply out of a desire to have a new environment to reach new people. So they really just wanted to have a new space to reach new people in ways that they weren't currently with their current ministries and their current environments.
For a planter to be able to articulate, this is what I believe God is calling me to do, and this is why I believe God is calling me to do this, and this is how I see this thing unfolding. Oftentimes, I'll ask them, if you were to close your eyes and picture what you believe your church could look like in 3 years. Close your eyes and tell me about what you see. Tell me about the people that you're seeing. Tell me about what the people are doing as they're reacting, relating to one another, what kinds of activities are happening. Just describe for me that picture.
For the first 2 or 3 months, all we did, every other week, we would meet for hours and build community and fellowship and do spiritual formation and pray and answer those questions. And each of those folks had people that were not in church that they were praying for and using as information givers. And they were very upfront. I am not trying to manipulate you. I'm not trying to get you to come to this church that we're going to start. But we're trying to find out if you were to ever even consider going to a church, what would it need to look like? How would it need to be? And what would make you want to go? And what would keep you away? And so over 2 or 3 months, we gathered the information from these folks that didn't go to a church. And so we began processing that. So we decided that our vision was going to be to offer a real, relevant, and non-threatening experience.
We have a specific demographic named. We're really looking at mid-30s to mid-40s, mainly families with young children, either elementary school or middle school, but we get that demographic because we do a broader range of, or a broader survey of the demographics of this community, and so that's naturally seems to be the disconnected fall within that demographic specifically. But really the demographic is just for anybody who is compelled by this vision, who's compelled by the message of this ministry. So that's really, we're trying to reach anybody that we feel like God's Spirit is drawing here, or anybody that wants to get on board with what we're doing.
It is a very unique setting. It was a very unique vision. We're more of a progressive church in a very conservative landscape, so that in and of itself is a little different. But we became this safe space where people could kind of come in, lower their guard, be honest with God about what was going on in their life, and really what we're trying to do is to create a space here where folks can find their way home.
They've been a part of an institution, a church, and they don't want anything to do with it anymore. That's who we're trying to reach. And that has meant for 3.5 years that sometimes people are unhappy because if you worship at West, it doesn't look like a church. And it's hard if you grew up with tradition and you grew up with things like the Lord's Prayer and the Apostles' Creed and Amazing Grace and those things, it's hard because you miss them. Or communion on the first Sunday of every month. We have communion, but it's based on where it's most relevant in that message series. And so sometimes it'll be 3 weeks apart. Sometimes it'll be 8. It just depends on when it fits best, because unchurched people, it's a little weird. It's your body, it's your blood. So we try to do a very solid job of teaching what communion is when we offer it. It's not just something we do. And I'm not saying that it is in any Methodist church, but I'm just saying more education, I believe, has to occur on the front end of that sacrament. So people who are experiencing it for the first time are able to receive the grace that we believe comes through that. So the vision has been always to reach unchurched, de-churched people by being real, relevant, and non-threatening in absolutely everything that we do.
Yeah, I've been influenced by several people, several pastors, several leaders, and several churches over the years. I would say that mostly it has been from Ginghamsburg Church up in Ohio there, Mike Slaughter, and his vision and the way that he turned a small, established traditional church into just a large, beautiful, vibrant, life-changing local church there. And so their restart model was something that really kind of captivated me, and I got to see and participate in through their Change the World conference. Another big influence is Andy Stanley at North Point Community Church. So I've been there several times and gone to some of their drive conferences and read quite a bit of Andy Stanley's books. And some other ones have been David Platt out of Birmingham and his book Radical.
So then I went to the Willow Creek Leadership Summit and heard Harvey Carey preach or speak. And he talked about being a no huddles, or being involved in no huddles. And it's time for religious people, the churches and the leaders of the churches to break out of the huddle. You know, if you drive by these pretty big brick buildings with the steeple on Sunday morning and you see all these cars in the parking lot, it's like going to think of this big sporting event like Super Bowl. You pay big money to go watch these people play, and they run out on the field. And, you know, there's all this fanfare and music and lights, and they get ready to play the game, and the buzzer sounds, and nothing happens. And you look down on the field, and all the players that you've paid hundreds of dollars to see play, they're still sitting or standing there in a huddle. And you're confused because they're supposed to be doing something. They're supposed to be playing the game. And so halftime comes. You think, okay, well, we just hit a little bump in the road. And then they go off the field, great halftime show, they come back. And you wait on them to play the second half of the game, and they still never break out of the huddle. The game ends, there's no score, because they never got engaged enough to play the game. They never broke out of their huddles. If you're unchurched and you drive by or if you're even marginally churched and you drive by our institutions on a Sunday morning during the magic worship hours, it looks a lot like we are those teams that won't ever break out of the huddle because they don't see the church, the institution of the church, doing things that make a difference in this world. We talk about it all the time, but we don't do anything. So he said, folks, it is time for you to break out of your huddle. And I thought, that's it. That's it. We need to be a missional body of Christ that is not about being in a huddle. I went to boot camp produced by it was in Texas through the Methodist, you know, our Path 1 stuff. And I'd gone to the Willow Creek thing, heard the no huddles, went to boot camp, and came back with knowledge about casting a vision. And I also had the opportunity to meet with Adam Hamilton. Then Williamson's Chapel was one of the 100 largest churches in America, Methodist churches. And so he was in the beginnings of networking those churches. And so I had the opportunity to go to Church of the Resurrection as the missions pastor. And so Rob hooked me up with Molly, who was Res West pastor at that time, campus pastor, and Adam. And I had the opportunity to spend like 2 or 3 hours with her and interview her and find out what was working, what didn't, what should we do, what shouldn't we do. And that was the coolest thing ever, to be able to learn from them. And so I came back and knew that the questions we needed to ask were the ones that he talks about all the time. Why do people need God? Why do people need the church? And why do people need this church?
It came out of, and I believe this is part of our theological task as United Methodists, when we do interact with people and when we do understand our target group, then there's something that natural that happens out of that God kind of unfolds. And you've just got to be willing not only to capture that vision as it bubbles up, because it's going to bubble up within the community, it's going to bubble up within the community of faith. And the planter's responsibility is to kind of capture that and continue to keep people on task. So there wasn't really a model that I would say that drove what unfolded here. What unfolded here was just something really special that God's done. And our role is to kind of just get out of the way and allow God to kind of unfold that. I think a lot of people make the mistake of saying, oh, well, this model is really cool. And we take that model from somewhere like in Atlanta and we try to plop it down into our context here. None of that works. Or people come and see me all the time and say, hey, I really like what you've got going on here. We want to do that in, Moxville or something like that. And my response to that is, it just doesn't work that way. You've got to really understand your community and understand the needs to allow something to emerge. God created us uniquely individual, and God, I believe, creates opportunities for Christian community to come together in unique ways. And if we get out of God's way, that'll just happen naturally.
One of the, I think, common mistakes that church planners make, and it comes from this rush to having something down on paper. Vision statement, mission statement, core values, strategic plans, goals, and all those kinds of things. I believe in all of that. But in the beginning stages, oftentimes, some make the mistake of looking at other churches like Church of the Resurrection, Ginghamsburg, whatever it happens to be, and they gravitate toward the vision statement of that church, and they tend to appropriate that. That's the vision. It seems to make sense, and so they don't do the kind of internal work and kind of soul searching to really begin to wrestle with what is it God is asking me to do. And oftentimes I just spend time helping them to kind of detox from some of that, because they've gone to the church planning training events, they've gone to some phenomenal experiences, and they think my vision is to be like them. No, your vision needs to be like the kind of church God is calling your church to be. We already have a Church of the Resurrection. We already have Ginghamsburg. We already have all these other places. So I think the derailment is to just simply rush past that personal discernment and wrestling time and try and just grab something, put it on paper, and have it look a lot like some of the things that are already happening.
Everything that we've done here, we measure against the vision, and it's been the guiding post of who we are. I believe that, particularly in new church development, if you do not have a guiding post as to who you are, you're not going to be successful, because you're going to move from here to here to here. You're going to try different tricks. If something doesn't work, you're going to want to move in another direction. But if you remain close to who you are and what God has revealed in the beginning, and you hold true to that, that vision becomes a guiding post for other ministries. So if someone comes up to you and says, well, man, I think we should, start an addiction ministry, we would look at that and measure it against the vision of the church to determine whether or not this is something that God wanted us to move forward with. And then we would move forward with it softly and see how it unfolded. But if if somebody come up to me and said, oh man, I think we should build a water park, well, the water park doesn't really fall in line with the vision for our church. And so that has to be a guiding post.
And so the leadership team that meets now every other month or so, I ask us to write down on the top of our paper, it isn't mine. The church isn't mine. My ministry that I lead is not mine. Us pastors, we say, well, my church, my staff, it's not mine, it's God's. And if we start thinking it's ours, then we lose sight of the vision that I believe Christ had. So we have to always remember that who we're trying to reach, that's who it should be about, and not about us. And that's hard.
as you grow and as the community of faith develops and as more people come on board, there are different things that happen within the church that enhance that vision. There are new ministries that come about, discipleship processes, assimilation processes, all those things you start to see naturally kind of feeding in to establishing and further providing a foundation for that vision. But the vision has always been the same. It stays on track with supporting the mission of the church, which is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Sometimes I think that we forget about that part of it, and we just say, well, we're going to build a church. Well, what's the purpose of that church? And, if you're going to create a doorway and windows and gateways for people to move from becoming a first-time guest to a fully devoted follower of Christ, then you certainly have to understand what your vision is and how that vision supports the mission of the church.